And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we are continuing our summary of our rather lengthy study of the Olivet Discourse. This is video number 818. Yeah, this is kind of an overview. No, I'm summarizing what we have seen in our study. Now, I hope that you really caught the power of what I shared with you yesterday about a great apostasy in the first century. Let me just pick up on that and drive that home just a little bit more, okay? Because the question is often raised as an objection. I'll never forget this. I was having one of my very first formal debates as a full preterist some years ago here or in Shawnee, Oklahoma. I'm sorry, right here in Ardmore. And I made the point against my opponent about the great apostasy. He was an amillennialist, and he just flat out denied the reality of the great apostasy in the first century. Well, pardon me, during one of the breaks, fellow came up to me and he said, Brother Preston, I'm understanding a lot of what you're saying about the Olivet Discourse, but he said, I just don't think that, I just don't understand how the church could have lost the understanding of eschatology that you are suggesting. And I said, well, it's due to the great apostasy, in my estimation. And he said, what are you talking about? And I answered, and I said, well, let's turn to Matthew chapter 24. So I went over the verses with him, pardon me, that spoke about the coming apostasy. Pardon me again. I'm not going to restart the video. This is real life. We sneeze, don't we? This is not a highly polished presentation. So anyway, I said, I want you to notice something here. That Jesus said, because lawlessness will increase, the love of the New American Standard Translation, the love of the majority shall grow cold. I cited Luke chapter 18 that I shared with you yesterday. When the Son of Man comes, will he even find faith on the earth? And he stood there literally stunned. Now, I understand. Believe you me, when I discovered these verses, I was stunned. I didn't know those verses existed about the possibility, about the reality of a great apostasy in the first century. I had always gone to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, when Paul was addressing the coming of the Lord, the gathering, the episynagoge. Some were saying that the day of the Lord had already come. Yes, that is what they were saying. And Paul says, don't let anyone deceive you, because that day, it's literally that day, will not come except there come first the apostasy. Apostasia. And by the way, folks, that's not the rapture. That's a radical suggestion. So anyway, here is Paul saying that before the coming of the Lord, the great apostasy had to take place. Well, growing up as an amillennialist, I always believed, that great apostasy, that was the Roman Catholic Church. Now, mind you, I'm not defending the Roman Catholic Church. Not in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But the point of fact is, that's not what it's talking about. Here is Paul writing, some say as early as 50 AD, having to refute the doctrine that the day of the Lord had already come. Think about that. Just think about that. I wrote a book on this some years ago entitled, How is this possible? I'm not going to go into great detail, but just simply ask yourself the question, okay? If the day of the Lord and the resurrection, 2 Timothy chapter 2:18, is what you and I were raised believing and even teaching, an earth burning, time ending, cosmos destroying event when every human being who has ever lived and died and decomposed comes out of the grave, reconstituted, revived. How could anybody how could anybody convince anybody it had already happened? Yeah, how's this possible? So anyway, here you have Paul, as he's writing to them in 50 AD, having to correct the idea that the day of the Lord had already come. Some things had to happen before that took place. The apostasy. So is it possible? Is it possible that the apostasy had already begun, ladies and gentlemen? To cause some people to believe, hey, day of the Lord's already come. When we come to Galatians chapter 1, Paul is writing not to one single church, but he's writing to an entire region of churches that he established. We don't know exactly how many there were, but it's multiple churches. And he said, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him who called you unto grace, unto another gospel, which is not another gospel. But there are some who would trouble you. Wait a minute, Paul. What are you talking about here? Writing to an entire region of churches. Paul said to them, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him who called you unto grace, unto another gospel, which is not another gospel. But there are some who would pervert it. And though he said, though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel than that which we have delivered unto you, let him be accursed. Folks, he's dealing with an apostasy in 49 AD, only 16 years after Pentecost. Have we ever thought about that before in regard to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, in regard to Matthew chapter 24, 10 to 13? Because after all, Matthew 24, 13 is false teachers going to come along. They're going to teach antinomianism. They're going to teach all sorts of false doctrines. Oh, and by the way, Jesus said in Luke chapter 21 and verse 8, many will come in my name saying, I am he. Oh, wait, what? Yeah. Jesus said in his generation, there were some men going to come saying, I'm the Christ. I've come. Do not go after them. Is it possible that all of this plays into our understanding of the great apostasy in the first century? If not, why not? And furthermore, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and again, my view of that chapter was, well, that came along with the Roman Catholic Church in the 7th century, the 6th century, even the 5th century. But wait a minute, Paul said concerning the man of sin, he exalts himself and he sits in the temple of God. Well, some have tried to make that out, that it's in the church. I don't believe that's accurate. I believe Paul's talking about the man of sin having to be related to the Jewish high priesthood, taking upon him the power of God, as it were, and he sits in the temple of God. But Paul says before the man of sin is manifested as who he really is, in other words, instead of being the servant of Yahweh, instead of being the spokesman for Yahweh, in reality, he is the enemy of God. He is the arch enemy of God. Now, I don't have time this morning to go into this, but starting in the Old Testament, all the way through the New Testament, there is a constant refrain that Israel in the last days would become the enemy of God. After all, She became the enemy of God, the 10 northern tribes did, when she turned to idols. Judah and Benjamin became the enemy of God in her apostasy, leading her to her destruction in AD 70. And in the New Testament, speaking of the Jews, in their resistance, and the Judaizers, I might add, and their resistance to the gospel of Jesus Christ, Paul said their God is their belly, their glory is their shame. And I tell you now, even weeping. Now, why would he weep over those individuals? Well, because they were his kinsmen, according to the flesh, who were rejecting the gospel, holding on to the old covenant system. But he said, I tell you now, even weeping, they are the enemies of the cross. What, Paul? You're telling us that God's, quote, chosen people for 1,500 years have now become the enemy of Christ? That's exactly what he was saying. And so this apostasy that Paul is talking about was going to be revealed, manifested as the enemy of God. And Paul said he, man of sin, is being restrained at the time Paul wrote. Well, I wonder if the man of sin would have anything to do with the apostasy, either in Israel or even an apostasy in the church by persecuting the church. And Jesus said, because persecution shall arise, many shall fall away. So yeah, he can be responsible for the falling away, not only of Israel, but also of those in the church by persecution. Now look, folks, you can't restrain. The restrainer, Paul said, is restraining him even now. That's in 51, 52 AD. So the restrainer was already at work, restraining the man of sin. And Paul in Galatians said the apostasy was already at work. And by the way, have you ever noticed 1 Corinthians? 1 Corinthians, we look at very, very often. My goodness, they're a model church. Wait a minute. They had problems with sectarianism. Well, one of you says, I'm of Paul, one of Cephas, one of Apollos. So, brethren, I can't even write to you as grown men because you're sectarian. They had problems of going along with one another. They had problems of one of the members sleeping with his father's wife. They had problems with marriage relationships. They had problems of eating of meat. Chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10. They had problems concerning an abuse and misuse, a misunderstanding the charismatic gifts. They had misunderstanding concerning the resurrection, chapter 15. Everywhere you turn in the book of 1 Corinthians, you have apostasy taking place. My point here is, ladies and gentlemen, that everything that Jesus said, everything that we have discussed, and some of this that I've shared with you just now, I did not discuss earlier in our discussion of the apostasy. So it's very, very relevant to our understanding of the Olivet Discourse and the first century fulfillment. Okay? When we deny, when we deny the reality of a first century apostasy, either of Israel, thinking maybe that wouldn't be affecting the church, then we're wrong. Or if we believe, have never realized there was an apostasy within the church of massive proportions. Again, Luke chapter 18, we are not acknowledging the historical reality of what happened in the first century. That means perhaps, just perhaps, we ought to re-examine our views of the Olivet Discourse. All right? We got more on the flip side. So I'll see you there.